Hello, I'm Doug Montgomery, the instructor in our design and experiments booth, and I want to welcome you to our monthly Fireside chat. I host these Fireside chats with a guest speaker to talk about interesting topics, real-world applications of experimental design. Uh, in addition to having our guest speakers presentation, we always have some time for Q&A. So if you're taking the Coursera courses, if you're applying experimental design in your work, or simply curious about what's going on here, a great opportunity to ask questions. And you can ask any kind of question you like, either about the course content, about our speaker's topic, or if there's some problem that's you're working on that's kind of bugging you, we'd be glad to talk with you about that as well. For those of you who can't join us live, we always post the Fireside Chat recordings on our LinkedIn page. And that's also linked to our YouTube channel. And our producer, Nikki, will share the link to that in the meeting chat. For participants in the course from Coursera, these recordings will also be available in your course under the Resources tab. So with that, talk a little bit about etiquette. Please, if you're in the audience, continue to keep your mics muted and your cameras off so we don't have any unusual disturbances, like your dog barking or something like that. and if you want to submit a question to either me or to our guest, please do that using the chat function on the Zoom menu. And you don't need to wait until the Q&A starts to submit the question. You can start putting that in anytime you want during the session. And hopefully we'll get the questions answered during this time. If we don't, we'll try to answer it offline and we'll respond to it in Coursera for those people that are enrolled in the course. So a little bit of etiquette, and now I should introduce our guest for today. Our guest is David Steinberg, who is a professor of statistics at Tel Aviv University, former chair of the School of Mathematical Statistics. He specializes in statistical design experiments with applications across a lot of different fields. He's published over 130 journal papers. He led the Statistics Laboratory at Tel Aviv University and contributed a lot to medical research. I've known David for a long time. I've always been a great admirer of his work. He's a recipient of the George Box Medal from NBUS and the Walter Shewhart Medal for his lifetime contributions to quality and to industrial statistics. He's a former editor of Technometrics and currently serves the editorial boards of that journal, along with the Journal of Quality Technology and the Journal of Uncertainty Quantification. So I'm really delighted to have David here. And he's staying up late in Tel Aviv to talk to us today. And I really appreciate the effort he's gone through to do that. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Doug. Actually, it's only 7:30 in the evening, so it's not that late here yet. But definitely is evening here already. So thank you very much for the kind introduction and for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here and join you for the course. Let me put up my slides, make sure they go up okay. Okay, just a second. Okay. So you should all be able to see the slides now, correct?
Yes, I see him just fine.
Okay, very good. And I assume you can follow my cursor as well, right? So I can point to things with the cursor as we go.
Absolutely, I see it all.
Okay, great. So again, thank you for the invitation to be here. And I'm going to talk about a topic that's been of a lot of interest to me in recent years, and that's experimental design in the online economy and in the online world, not just going on, not just in the online economy, but just about everything that happens online. And here's a quick outline of the topics that I'm planning to go through. Okay, well, I can't imagine anyone is here who's not using the internet because you're all connected to this course via the internet. Uh, there were a couple times in the past when I gave this talk, and one of the first things I did, gave it live, and I asked people at the start of the talk, when was the last time you took part in as a subject in an experiment? And people started thinking about, well, maybe they were in a psychology course at some time and they were asked to take part in an experiment or something they did in high school where they actually took part in an experiment. And the next question is, well, have any of you been on the internet in the last half hour? To which most of them answered yes. And I said, you've all been subjects in an experiment in that last half an hour. These online experiments are going on all the time, and it's no wonder because the internet really is a dominant force, certainly economically, but more broadly than just in the economy. So we buy things, we sign petitions, we market ourselves, we contribute money, we join organizations. Amazing the number of things that we can do now sitting at our desks or just working off of our phones. Estimate from Forbes on global online sales for 2024, $6.3 trillion with an expected growth to 7.9 by 2027. And from Forbes advisors, start thinking today about how to sell products online to avoid becoming obsolete. So if you don't have an internet presence, it's becoming harder and harder to really survive economically. So how do experiments get run online? And the more common name that you'll hear for the online experiments is A/B tests, although I think online experiments or online controlled experiments is a much more all-embracing name. And as we'll see soon, the A/B tests sort of imply a really simple plain vanilla format, which is quite common, but certainly not the only thing you can do. So when you're working on the web, when you're interacting with the web, there are all kinds of things that are happening that in the case of many websites are designed to get you to do something. So they may things that may determine whether what you do are the landing page that you've come to, the graphics that are there. There may be some click sequences that are involved. How do you order click sequences? Various purchase options. Some of the things may not be visible to you at all. They may be behind the scenes algorithms that are being changed by the company. Companies want to know what works, and the way they're finding out more and more is through online controlled experiments. So here's sort of a couple typical examples. So very, again, plain vanilla example is you want to compare two landing pages. So you have a standard version, you've come up with a new improved, at least you think so, test version. And you want to know, is the test version really better? So users come to your site, you randomly allocate them to one of those versions, and then you see what they do. Now, what are they doing? There are all kinds of different outcomes that you might look at. For economic sites, typically what you're going to be concerned about is money spent. You may be interested if you're a site that's offering software, has the person installed your software? Have they done what's known as a conversion? Conversion could be spending money, it could be signing something, joining something, many other measures. You may want to track the amount of time they're on your site. One of the most common choices to look at is what's called click-through rate, just because it's very quick and easy to see if someone clicks on a link that's on that page. And in particular, if you're Google, it makes a big difference because that's part of the way Google makes money. And of course, this is true also for many sites that are selling advertising space. They get money if you click on those ads. So here's sort of a typical example. This is a website from an exercise site. They wanted to compare a streamlined version of the homepage to the original. And just to get some ideas, as the original, it does look a little bit, to me, a little bit crowded and uncomfortable. Well, when they switched from the original to the new version, they increased their conversion rate, the fraction of people who joined their exercise program from 24.4% of those who entered to almost 30%. Big money. Here's another example. I apologize. This is copied, of course, from some other source, and these are not so clear in terms of looking at what's on these pages. But this is a site that's offering care for your feet, and they wanted to compare the original and new versions. You can see some differences, like, for example, over here where there's the extra blue boxes, whereas here there was only one. And there are a number of other changes on these on the page between these two. Management really liked the new version. They were sure this was going to be a big winner. This was going to bring in more money. But revenues dropped. In fact, they dropped dramatically. What happened? Well, it turned out that the company had made a number of different changes to the site. So in a sense, this was like a factorial experiment because they changed a number of things, but they didn't really run a factorial experiment. They changed everything at once. They had none of the changes, entirely the old site, or all the changes, that was the new site. And when that happened, they, as I said, they lost money. So what did they do? They began to check one at a time what was going on with each of those different changes. And what they discovered was that the new site had a reference to discount coupons. Well, okay, if you went into the site and you saw this thing about discount coupons, were you going to join? Not unless you had a discount coupon. And not everyone had discount coupons. So they discovered that discount coupon, mentioning that discount coupon, that was the Achilles heel. And when they removed that reference, revenues went up. Company that I worked for is a company that offers loans. They work in the loan market. And although it's a company here in Israel, most of the market is the U.S. loan market. Well, one of the things that the company did was, of course, whenever we made an offer, we had to set the interest rate. And we do so on the basis of a lot of information that we're getting from the loan applicants. Well, it turned out that, of course, pretty naturally, when you increase the interest rate, you decrease the conversions. You have fewer people who take your offer. One of the things that was of great interest to the company was to assess elasticity. So, to what extent does the drop in conversions is that related to the interest rate? So this is a standard economics question, right? Increase the price, in this case, the interest rate, and you're going to get less demand. To what extent? How sensitive are customers to the interest rates that you're offering? And the company ran regular A/B tests to look at that question. So the A/B test would be varying the interest rates around a standard rate in order to get an idea of just how sensitive customers are, loan applicants are to what you offer them. Of course, remember, this is being run online. This is on real loan applicants. So you can't use a real wide range of interest rates. You have to keep this pretty narrow. And if you keep things pretty narrow, you're looking at a small range of the input factor. And as a result, you're not going to get very large effect sizes. So you're going to need fairly large sample sizes to be able to get a good picture of the elasticity. I want to go back to some basics. So at some point during the courses, I'm sure you've run into some of the basic ideas in design that R.A. Fisher put forward. And all of those, at least to a certain extent, are very relevant in the world of online experiments. So I do want to talk just a little bit about how those come into play in the online world. It's a picture of Fisher, and below that, Latinic square experiment at the Rothamsted Experiment Station, where he did his pioneering work on design. Of course, you can't see anything like that, no visuals like that for internet experiments, but some things like that do happen. So the four basic principles that Fisher put out were randomization, and primarily at the design stage to remove potential sources of bias. so that you can claim that there's a unbiasedness, a fairness to the experiment. Although Fisher, of course, also used this as a basis for inference in many experiments. Blocking, so that if you have unwanted variation because your experimental material, in our case, surfers on the internet who are coming to your site, are heterogeneous, you want to block them into more homogeneous groups. Replication, so that you get an estimate of experimental error and improve precision by having larger sample size. And factorial experiments, so that you study a number of things at the same time. Randomization is absolutely standard in online testing, but it's not always trivial to set up an online platform that's going to do this properly. So one of the things that companies do in order to test their platform, to make sure that they're, the way, remember, this all has to happen automatically. So there has to be software in the background that's running all of this and running it all fast enough so that, of course, if you come into a website, you're not even aware that there's something going on in the background that's dictating, what you're going to get in an experiment. In fact, you're in an experiment. One of the things that companies do is to run AA tests to check that the scheme is working properly. Schemes are working properly. And what an AA test does is it assigns everyone to the same thing. Well, if everyone's getting assigned to the same thing, then you can check, for example, if the groups are really coming out balanced with respect to potentially relevant covariance that you hadn't tried to block. You can check to make sure that there are no dramatic differences in response rates between the two. If you run an AA test, everyone's getting the same landing page, and one of them is a lot more effective than the other, this raises some suspicion as to the way your system is working. One concern, of course, with the internet is you may have repeat entries of the same individual. And if so, you want to make sure you preserve treatment assignments. It's a special feature of the internet experiments. In some cases, and this was the case with our interest rate experiments, it's actually illegal to randomize. So there are various laws in the U.S. governing financial arrangements that made it illegal to randomize. And what we did as an alternative was we simply computed check digits from the background data on everyone and come out more or less random, and that was what was used to assign the loan applicants to different experimental groups. Blocking gets used a lot. This may be on the basis of known covariates. So here are some typical examples: sex, geography, time of day or week, etc. And often when we're on the web, we're providing lots of information to the people to the site, and that information can get used. Another related issue is that there may be time effects. Certainly, things that run in cycles. So, looking over a 24-hour day, what happens for you in the morning may be different than what happens for me, where it's already evening. And certainly for any site that has international exposure, those kind of time of day effects are going to be potentially relevant. There may be day of the week effects as well. Weekends may be different than weekends, etc. And certainly to watch holidays. So these all are elements that you want to take into account in terms of blocking. Replication, well, as I said, effect sizes are typically small. And so replication is like a no-brainer. And the internet sites are getting lots of visitors. So sample sizes tend to be not just replicated, but huge. You get some extremely large sample sizes in A/B tests. But you need them because of the small effect sizes. I already talked about that with regard to how much you can change the interest rates. Factorial structure. Now that's one that Fisher was a big proponent of, but it's not so common on the internet. A lot of tests really are very simple, plain vanilla tests that are looking at just two options. So although I think there's a lot more room to exploit factorial testing on the internet, it's not yet really the rule. Sometimes there's a single factor which is given a huge number of levels. The classic here is the 41 Shades of Blue experiment that was run by Google. So this was looking at the color that Google used for links on its web pages. And again, Google makes money when you click on a link. So this is a big deal if they can get you to click more by changing the color. Well, who would think that it would make that much a difference? The estimate was $200 million in annual revenue. Not bad, not bad. Maybe small change for Google, but still a healthy piece of chunk of cash. One of the areas that I've worked in is specifically using factorial experiments. And together with a student of mine, Tamar Heisler, we showed that indeed in the online environment, there are very clear advantages in using factorial experiments. You can identify which factors are important. You can do it faster. You can exploit influential factors, much more efficient than trying to test everything one factor at a time, which often happens. So oftentimes there will be different groups will have priority over different parts of a web page or different parts of a process that can be changed. And each of those groups may make one change. So what you actually get is a lot of people in a control group, and then essentially a whole collection of one factor at a time experiments that are sort of running in parallel, just not very efficient. The Dr. Footcare experiment that I talked about earlier was a very good example. So there actually were, if I remember right, 5 different factors that were changed between the old landing page and the new one. And then when they turned out to not be a good idea, they went back to the new one and began to test each of those factors one at a time. They could have run a factorial experiment. They would have learned, had they done that from the start, they would have learned much faster that mentioning the coupon was the discount coupon was a big loser, and tested all the other factors to see which of those really did improve things. Sometimes the reasons are logistical. Again, as I said, they may be due to ownership, and that may make it difficult to make multiple changes. Sometimes there's unplanned factorial structure. This is something that I know LinkedIn does quite a lot. So when you go into LinkedIn, you may actually be allocated to several different experiments. So these are all sort of, one factor at a time experiments. So for example, you might be in a client-side landing page experiment, and at the same time in a server-side algorithm experiment. Okay, for the landing page, you're allocated between 2 landing pages. For the algorithm, you're allocated between 2 different algorithms. And these 2 experiments were running, they're 2 separate experiments, but they happen to be running in parallel. And since there are visitors who are getting allocated in both of them and participating in both of them, you can actually combine the results. And then you do have a factorial structure that lets you, and it's sort of a happenstance factorial structure, but it's a factorial structure. And then you can look at things in interactions and the other things that are possible with factorial. What's special? I hope you've given some idea already. There are a number of things that are special about these experiments. So what's different about them? Well, again, the effect sizes are expected to be quite small and typically are. And many experiments, at least what I hear and what gets published from people who are working with companies running a lot of experiments, most experiments turn out negative. They have no effect at all. Makes no difference. When there are effects, they tend to be small, and so you need quite large sample sizes. Okay, they're run on real site visitors. So at the same time that you're learning and trying to figure out what works better, you're trying to make money, or you're trying to get them to join your organization. And you want results. You don't want to sacrifice the bottom line in order to learn. You have to continue watching the bottom line. Another interesting aspect is conditional effects. I'll talk about that in a little bit more, as well as interference and repeat testing and use of Bandit allocation. I'll go into all of those in a bit more detail. So again, here we have experiments run on real time on actual visitors. If you do something that harms you, for example, the Dr. Foot Care coupon, discount coupon, it can cost you a lot of money. And consequently, most changes that are made are small ones. Again, the interest rates that we were offering, we weren't going to give anyone a really low interest rate. That just didn't make any sense. So if the set interest rate, the algorithm interest rate was say 12%, you might reduce that as low as 10%, but that's it. No, you're not going to get a discount more than that. So you're seeing small changes, and that's going to mean small effects. Another thing aspect that goes on with this is how the randomization happens. And again, this is certain conservativeness, business conservatism, is you may not want to do a 50-50 randomization because you're concerned it's going to cost you money. So what you may want to do is certainly initially allocate a much smaller fraction than 50% to a test version in order to make sure that it's not doing any serious harm. Once you verify that that's the case, then you can change that. Conditional effects is a topic that's gotten a lot of press in the statistical literature in recent years, and it's of great interest within the online testing community. So, I mean, if you think about a typical experiment, one of the things you want to do is you want to estimate a treatment effect. And suppose I denote that by theta. And think of this for now in the plain vanilla context. That just compares the expected outcome between the two versions. Okay, but now I've got lots of background information. And the background information could be demographics, it could be past site experience, and lots of things that get collected on us as we're using the internet. And now a very interesting question is, might it be possible that this treatment effect is not uniform across everyone, rather that theta is a function of X? So for example, with the loan applicants, certainly possible, and in fact likely, that some loan applicants are really sensitive to the interest rate, have a very high elasticity, and others are pretty immune to it. You can reduce the rate. It's not going to really change the rate at which they convert. You can increase the rate. It's not really going to reduce dramatically the fraction who takes your loan offer. And of course, the information that we use for that can be very rich. When someone fills out an online loan application, if you've ever done that, you're giving quite a bit of information about yourself that's relevant to whether or not you're a good loan risk. Okay, well, very interesting to know if loan applications are taken up more often when by certain people. And there's a lot of very interesting research in the causal inference literature that goes into these methods. One of the things that's rather different, and I've run into this with a couple of companies, is that they want to really take that causal inference literature and apply it sort of blindly to online experiments. Well, one thing that goes on in the causal inference literature is most of that is directed toward observational data and not experimental data. And when you have experimental data, it just cuts out a lot of the problems that the causal inference is concerned with in adjusting for the fact that who gets A and who gets B may also be very dependent. Who's in group A and who's in group B may be very different as a function of X in observational data. But if you're careful about the way you've done your A/B experiment, it shouldn't make any difference at all in an online experiment because you've randomized those people. So, but still some very useful, interesting ideas there that can be applied, analysis ideas. Interference is related to a very standard assumption, something that I think probably most of you, if you're running experiments, can take almost for granted, almost without thinking about it. Your instructor writes on the slides, the data are statistically independent, right? Now that's the state, data are always independent, right? Well, maybe not. If you're Meta and you're running an experiment, your users are connected in a network and you know an awful lot about that network. So if you're randomized in a Facebook experiment to group A, then your responses my responses certainly might influence Facebook friends of mine who were randomized to group B. So you have to be pretty careful about how to take account of this potential. And this, again, goes under the name of interference, but it really goes back to this idea of, are the data statistically independent? And here you have good information that lets you get some insight into that and potentially take advantage of it in the analysis. Repeat testing. So what happens? You're running these tests and it's going on online across time. And as time goes on, you get more and more results. And of course, what do you want to do when you're getting results? You want to look at them, right? So you peek as you're going along. Well, if you peek, for example, if you're looking at something like a p-value, you're really generating a sequential test here. But if you're computing those p-values without taking into account the sequentiality and the constant looking, the constant monitoring, you completely distort the actual p-values that you compute. So you may think you've reached a 1% rejection limit, but in fact, there may be a much higher probability that you will have falsely rejected an hypothesis that there's no difference between sites. One of the things that I've seen a number of sites claim is that, and companies claim, is that if you do this using Bayesian inference, you don't have that problem. Well, it don't work. I'm a big proponent of using Bayesian inference on these examples, but don't think it's going to solve this problem of repeat testing. It's a tricky problem, and it requires some very careful attention. What about changing allocation as you begin to go along? So I want to talk a little bit about this learn-earn dilemma that goes on in some experiments. So learning, you want to know what's important, what factors make a difference, and so on. And at the same time, you want to make money, you want to earn. So once you begin to learn, you want to exploit that and put that to work. If you are beginning to learn that option B is much better than option A, you may want to divert more traffic to option B. If you're running a factorial experiment, and this is the sort of questions that Tamar Heisler and I looked at, and you begin to learn that one of the four factors in your experiment is making a big difference. So, for example, if you were running that Dr. Footcare experiment as a factorial, you begin to learn that having the coupon reference on the landing page that's just something you don't want to do. Stop doing it. So gradually stop allocating that page. And there are some very, very interesting methods for doing that, what are known as Bandit methods. This goes back to some very old work in experimental design on learning and earning. And what Bandit methods do is they let you adjust the randomization to favor the more successful options as you go. What seems to be the going method in online controlled experiments is something called Thompson sampling. This was popularized by Google, and I have a couple references here. The first to a paper which came out actually already 10 years ago now, so it's been around for a while. And the idea with Thompson sampling is that as you go, you compute. So again, I'm going to phrase this in terms of a simple A/B experiment, but you can certainly generalize this. So as you go, you can continually update via Bayesian calculation the probability that version A is the better of your two versions. Again, think of this in the simple A/B context. All right. Well, a new user comes. What's the probability that you allocate that user to version A with that particular probability? And there's a very simple algorithm to do that. You just actually, if you have some distribution here that this is based on, you may not have that probability directly. This may be something you're computing from some underlying space. So, for example, you may have posterior distributions for the mean under A, say the mean revenue, and the mean revenue under B. Well, take samples of both of those. So take a sample from the A posterior, take a sample from the B posterior. If the one you sampled from the A posterior is bigger than the one you sampled from the B posterior, assign that next person to A, and that exactly matches assigning to version A with the probability that version A is better. And there are a variety of ways to sort of cool this down, because this tends to get overexcited and switch to better versions too quickly, but it does work quite well. It also poses some interesting statistical challenges, because using these Bandit methods complicates statistical inference. It actually turns out, and this is something, and one of the first things you learn in statistics, right, is if you want an unbiased estimator of an expected value, you compute a sample average, right? Sample averages are actually biased estimators if you're using these Bandit allocation methods. Sounds bizarre, but that's true. And this is some simulations that from the paper of mine with Tamar Heisler, where we're looking at different allocation methods and looking, block here means times. This is more and more users. This is if you use completely random allocation. You can see that regardless of what the response probability is, we're getting unbiased estimators if we use random allocation. The two bottom lines are two different versions of Thompson sampling, and both with the better page. This one has a 2.9% probability of response, this one only a 0.6% probability. With both of them, the long-term average, this is averaged over a collection of simulations, is below the actual probability. And that's simply a feature of the method, and it's something you have to make some adjustments for. I'm going to end with just some comments about ethics. And this is rather dated example now, but I think it's perhaps one of the most dramatic. Always a question of what goes on when you're running experiments, and certainly when you're running experiments, in this case, invariably, these are on people, because you're looking at experiments that are looking at what happens when people are interacting with your website. This is an experiment that was run not just by Facebook, but this is actually run by academics, if I remember right, from Cornell. We're very interested in looking at what happens online when we see different kinds of content. Does that affect our emotions? Well, they got collaboration with Facebook to run this experiment. Of course, Facebook I don't know what went on in Facebook in terms of ethics and what what kind of ethical checks there were there, but certainly the academics must have gone through the institutional review board at their university. Well, this is all from a Wall Street Journal article that came out on it. A furor erupts over Facebook's experiment on users. Almost 700,000 unwitting subjects had their feeds altered to gauge effect on emotion. So again, these are quotes from the article. So what this experiment was, and again, on nearly 700,000 users, they wanted to see if posting items that were either more positive or negative in their content would change the emotional state of the Facebook users. And so during a 1-week period, they enabled an algorithm which would omit content that contained words associated with, in one case, positive emotions, and in the other case, negative emotions. And these were from news feeds that people were getting on Facebook. The research gave very clear results. So in terms of being a scientific experiment, it accomplished its goal. And it did show that, without question, manipulating the material that you see, in particular the emotional content of it, affects what you do. It affects the way you feel. And here's a comment that came out from this blog post. What many of us feared is already a reality. Facebook is using us as lab rats, and not just to figure out which ads we'll respond to, but actually change our emotions. And certainly when you're interacting with the internet, people who are running experiments on the internet do want to change what you're doing. This is one that was perhaps much too directly involved with with people's emotions, and it generated quite an uproar. So with that, I'm just going to close with some take-home messages. Online controlled experiments are being used all the time. You're taking part in them. They're for companies that are active on the internet, and that's just about everyone these days, they're a great tool for data-driven decision making. The basic experimentation principles that R.A. Fisher put forth are relevant, and to a certain extent, with the exception of factorial experimentation, are certainly getting used. There's a lot of room, in my opinion, for factorial experimentation. So it's come up with some of the companies that I've talked to here. And for one reason or another, it has yet to materialize in the companies that I've worked with here. But I think it really does have a lot of potential. And there are also many new and interesting, fascinating questions that come up as a result of the internet environment. And these are going to continue to be with us, and we're going to continue to deal with them. And finally, I'm just going to put up a few sources. I'll be happy to make the slides available so you can don't start copying or doing you don't have to do screenshots of this. The slides will be available afterwards. And these are really site sources that are giving some basic information on online controlled experiments. And if anyone wants a real starter, I would start with this article by Larson et al., which came out a couple of years ago in the American Statistician. Does a very nice job of talking about the world of online controlled experiments. So with that, I think we can open for discussion and chat.
David, thank you very much. This has been a very informative presentation. And I suspect that there are a lot of people that just don't realize that literally every time they get into the computer and go to a website, that they're a participant in an experiment.
Right. That's right.
I think a lot of people just simply don't realize that, but it's true. It's happening as we speak. Do we have some questions? We have some questions from the audience already. So maybe we should get to those. The way we do this is Nikki posts them and I can see them.
In the chat.
And here's question one. It says, would you say that the conventional experimental approach to using design with triplicates, three X repeats instead of replicates, wasteful? Especially when it's possible to use duplicates with one replicate as a compromise.
Mm-hmm. I've run into this in different contexts, and there are certainly the areas where I've found that experimenters are much more inclined to go for triplicates as opposed to duplicates is in experiments where there's much more concern about things going bizarre and results coming out very, very off. And in those cases, I have found that sometimes experimenters do want to have a third result, so that if they had only two and they were quite different, then there's a third one that casts sort of the deciding vote, tells you which of those is really off. In most cases, most of the experiments that I've worked with, I think the experimenters have had much better control over what's going on, don't run into those kind of problems often at all, and are more efficiently served just by using duplicates. But it does definitely depend on context.
Yeah, I would guess that this maybe isn't as big a problem with online experiments.
No, with online experiments, there's really you're replicating so many times because you're getting a lot of individuals who are getting assigned to the same, effectively exactly the same experimental treatment. And again, when you start breaking them down into much finer resolution bins by the covariant information that you have, which is, as I said, is often quite extensive, then you may see situations where you don't have that many in some of those higher resolution cells. But when you break down a little bit less, then definitely you see lot of surfers usually in each potential treatment by covariate cell.
I would think that you can potentially collect a lot of covariant information on participants, and that gives you a lot of control over how you assign them to different treatments.
Definitely.
Is that true?
Yes, yes, definitely true. But again, if you want to use it, you have to be careful about you have to have a system that's going to do it quite quickly. Sometimes you don't have that information available yourself and you purchase it. So you can actually, there are actually situations where someone may log in and before you assign them, and this is all happening back off stage, the website actually purchases information from a site that has information on that particular user and exploits that as part of the experimental randomization.
But that can slow down the assignment of
Exactly. So you want to make sure that this doesn't lead to anything more than a blink of an eye in terms of how fast it goes. So that it has to be something that you can get very, very quickly.
I sort of know a little bit about this because I have a former PhD student that for his first job out of here was working for a company where they put him in this group that did these online experiments. And so he became sort of the expert on how to do a lot of this. And he's local. And from talking to him, and I've learned a bit about how they actually did things. And he did succeed in kind of moving them from the AB t-test world into some more complicated treatment structures, and with some success. I'm just surprised that more people aren't doing that.
Right. I've heard different things from different groups. I know some groups have had a fair amount of success in bringing this in, and others definitely less so.
Well, it leads to some complicated issues in terms of code writing, and I can see some reluctance to delve too deeply into that just because of some of the technical complications. Okay, we got another question. Question 2. This is kind of a general question. Central composite design often involve alpha values with decimal points for axial lengths. How important is it to use this to set the factor of the exact value down to the decimals when the equipment can only set the values in whole numbers? What do you think?
First, we're always dealing with the logistical constraints, and any experiment has to live within the logistical constraints that it's constrained by. And you can never, in theory, of course, you're always setting up these experimental plans with a specific computed alpha, which is in some sense an ideal. The sensitivity of the design to exactly where the points are is definitely there's sensitivity, but you can play with that a bit, and it doesn't make an enormous amount of difference. And obviously, again, if you're constrained, then you have to decide what's going to be within that constrained region, the constraints that you have. What's the best setting? Do you want to go a little bit tighter to the cube points in the design, or push the axial points a little bit further away?
Yeah, I once actually did a little bit of checking into this, and very simple. Just took one central composite design and played with the axial spacing and looked at variance dispersion graphs, and modest changes had almost no effect.
Right.
If you made a huge change, yeah, you'd see something. But I always tell my students, get as close as you can. You know? But you have to take, but you have to take the practicalities into account. You just may not
Absolutely.
be able to run 1.414.
Exactly. And it's not beyond the practicalities as well. I mean, there's always a question of how wide to make factor levels and how tight to make factor levels in experiment. As I said, for the online experiments, you're never going to see widely spread factor levels. And it's simply because people are afraid you may do something that's catastrophic and cost yourself a lot of money. So changes are always going to be very, very moderate. Um, when you're running an offline experiment, a lab experiment, or development experiment, then obviously you do have the option of being more liberal about how far you spread out levels. I remember one of the first experiments that I was ever involved in industry was one where a company was making a polymer, and they wanted to switch the main component in the polymer and replace it by a much cheaper component. And they were sure that this was going to, the engineer working on the process was sure this was going to be a successful change and this was going to work fine. And he put together an experimental plan where I think initially he was going to have ranges from, if I remember right, it was 70 to 90% of the material was going to come from this new material. Took it into his boss. First thing the boss said was, "You're crazy. You can't do that. This is a new material. This is never going to work. And until we know that it's going to work, you have to keep things at lower levels." He ran his first experiment at 40 and 60% instead of 70 and 90. Eventually, that experiment proved very successful. Turned out you could do it. It did work, and it saved a lot of money. They continued the experimentation and eventually did get to a level where the polymerization didn't happen. Of course, if he had started at that extreme level, he would have taken it into his boss, who had told him he was a bit wacko in the first place, and the whole project probably would have been dumped. So just what's the right place to start? Well, in that case, it was, as it turned out, definitely smarter to start lower, but it took them several iterations before they got up to the levels that eventually they used.
I sort of tell the students in my class that when it comes to choosing the ranges for factor levels, that you should view yourself as the mission of Captain Kirk and the Starship Enterprise. And what was that? That was to go boldly where no man has gone before. But be careful, because you don't want to blow up the plant.
Definitely.
That could be a career limiting decision. You try to get them to understand that you need to change things enough to be able to see something. But you at least in your initial experiments, you don't want to put things in the danger zone.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, so here's another interesting question. Is it possible to have excessive blocking in an experimental design? What would you consider a healthy balance for blocking?
Okay, this is a good question. I think the blocking can become problematic in that sense, and largely when the sample size is not that large, and you're blocking to the point where you're really getting down to the point where it's hard to fill blocks. And I'll give an example like that. This is not so much from the industrial, this is from the medical world, not from the industrial world. Experiment that I was involved in looking at design of algorithms for online care for children with type 1 diabetes. So they're hooked up to monitors. The monitors are feeding information into the into a center, and based on that, they may get an insulin boost at night from the algorithm. Okay, so how was the experiment blocked? Well, you can't recruit tons of young people to be in an experiment like this, and they intentionally wanted to have it cover several age groups. They wanted to have it cover several levels of the severity of the diabetes, and it was run at different clinics, and they wanted each clinic to have a certain amount of balance. So there's three elements that are going into the blocking. It's blocked by age group, by the base level of the disease, and it's blocked by the clinic. Well, what we eventually gave each clinic was, these are the patients you have to recruit, and you have to fill in two in each of a collection of blocks that we give you, blocks of age by severity. Some of the clinics weren't able to do it. So here the experiment is going on, and the company has limited time budget. They can't run this forever, and they're not getting patients who fill in some of the blocks. So we did some online tailoring, which was not ideal, but it allowed us to complete the experiment. And essentially, what we did was we took some extra people from some of the centers that were able to supply more. And that certainly can happen if you're trying to overblock an experiment, and you may not have enough experimental material, to cover all the different blocks. In the online case, that would probably, I suspect that would only happen if you're really trying to do some very high resolution blocking using a lot of different background information.
Of an alternative to blocking in a situation like that, could you think about treating some of that information as covariates?
Sure.
That would be a way to sort of at least try to take account of these nuisance sources of variability, but not formally blocking. But as long as it's something you can measure or quantify, treat it as covariate might be an alternative. Because the clinic problem that you describe, I can see that being a real complicated issue. Just finding enough patients to be able to get meaningful results. Yeah. Well, David, we are sort of approaching the end here. We're about to run out of time. I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed this. I'm going to see if I can get the recording of this over to my former student that was doing a lot of this A/B testing, and let him take a look at it. I think he would enjoy it very much. He's not doing that now. He changed jobs, and so he's off doing something completely different now. But in fact, he even did a fireside chat for us long ago, one of the early ones. And if I can dredge it up, I'll send you the link to it, because you might enjoy it.
Great. I enjoy watching it or getting any feedback you might have.
Yeah, he did a lot of really innovative work, I think, in this area with the company that he was with, and you might be interested in just chatting with him at some point, because he's a very bright guy, extremely bright guy. Well, thank you very much. I will let you relax now. It's time. It's probably time for you to have a cocktail now. I appreciate it very good to see you, and wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Good to see you too, Doug, and thanks again for the invitation.
Great.